Welcome to Conversatio, the Belmont Abbey College podcast, where we aim to form and transform our community so that we better reflect the image of God, which is a Benedictine hallmark, and we are a Benedictine institution. So welcome. I'm excited to welcome Dr. Thomas Varacalli of our Honors College. He's one of our professors in the Honors College, does a great job helping to form our students on a daily basis. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you for having me. This is my first podcast ever.
Wonderful. Uh, Unfortunately, it's not my first one, but certainly we enjoy doing them here at the Abbey, and we're excited to have you to talk about your new book. Give us so the title, "The Future of the Catholic Church in the American Political Order." Kind of a heady topic there, but it sounds extremely timely, given that we are coming up on an election year next year. So give us, first of all, just a sense of who you are, where you're from, how you found the Abbey, and then maybe talk about this idea of this book and how it came to fruition for you.
Sure. So I am an alumnus of Belmont Abbey. I graduated in 2011, and I had the time of my life as an undergraduate. Belmont Abbey College was transformative, and I was attracted to the Abbey as a high schooler because of its fidelity to the magisterium and the way in which it integrates faith and reason. I received my PhD from LSU in political science, and after 6 years of teaching at Texas State, I'm happy to be back in my second year. When I was at Texas State, my boss, Ken Grasso, the co-editor of this volume, who's also a very faithful Catholic, wanted to write a book about the intersection of the Catholic Church and the United States. Both seem to be at crossroads. The Catholic Church in the United States is reeling from the implications of the recent sex scandal, internal divisions of the Church caused by different interpretations of the Second Vatican Council, a vocation crisis, and increasing resistance among its members, among church members of core Christian Catholic doctrines on things like abortion. And then the United States seems to be in a period of internal crisis. We pay quite attention in the book to the dangers of an ever-increasing administrative state that is trying to regulate aspects of American life that are increasingly at odds with Catholic social teaching.
Great. It sounds, as I said, it's obviously very timely. I was just interested when I first saw the title, "The Future of the Catholic Church." You don't say the future of the Catholic individual, you say the future of the Catholic Church. Why that emphasis?
Well, the book is born out of a real gratitude for the Catholic Church. The United States has been quite kind to Catholics, despite periods of various forms of minor persecution in the 19th century. But the emphasis is on the church, not the institution, because we want to see to what extent the Catholic Church, the true church, is going to be able to navigate the significant challenges within the United States. There's always been the question, especially among Protestants, about whether or not Catholics can be loyal to the United States. And when we look at the year 1960, which the book uses as sort of the golden year for American Catholicism, that's the year in which John F. Kennedy was elected, Protestants had, for the most part, come to accept the Catholic place in the United States. Catholics had disproportionately served in the Second World War valiantly. Catholics had entered into the middle class, had moved from the ethnic ghettos to the suburbs, and Dwight D. Eisenhower had invoked the United States as a Judeo-Christian nation. Now you're hard pressed to find among our elites the invocation of America as a Judeo-Christian nation. Increasingly, the elites in our country are trying to make America a secular country. And so just as Catholics had entered the club, sort of say, had got their club membership in being accepted by American society, the church now is again increasingly at odds with the way in which the United States is moving currently.
You talk about that. I was able to, first of all, the book has not come out yet, but it's coming out very soon. But I had the opportunity at least to review the introduction, and in there you talk about it's not just you say it's not just secularism. It's more extreme than that, isn't it? It's like almost like a how did you describe it? It's like an anti-Christian movement that we're having in America these days.
Yes. For the last 10 years, we've witnessed the administrative state try and force the little sisters of the poor pay for contraception. We've seen the administrative state try and limit the freedom of pro-life advocates to pray peacefully in front of abortion clinics. We've seen the administrative state try and push various policies concerning sex that are contrary to the teachings of the Catholic Church. And there's been attempts to weaken what is called the ministerial exception. So Catholics, religious organizations are exempt from certain anti-discrimination laws, precisely because Catholics have the right to determine how the church is structured. The state should not interfere in how the state is structured. But because religious schools are is a church institution, the Catholic Church needs to ensure that it can discriminate in favor of Catholics in hiring, so that Catholic schools, Catholic hospitals, Catholic adoption agencies remain authentically Catholic.
And tell us, so you are an author and an editor of the volume, correct? And so tell us a little bit about, I mean, that whole process that I guess you went through. You brought an impressive group of folks to contribute to the book. Talk a little about how that came about, and then maybe is there one particular or several that you would like to highlight in terms of their perspectives?
Sure. So the book consists of 11 different contributors from a variety of different institutions around the country. Each contributor has a chapter. I would recommend these following chapters. The first, Stephen Brust from Eastern New Mexico University has a wonderful book on the enduring tensions within Catholicism, where he provides a history of the Catholic Church over the last 150 years about where a history of those situations where Catholicism has somewhat been in tension with the American political order. So, for example, in the 19th century, Brust goes over the legacy of Blaine amendments. So the Catholic Church and its hierarchy in the United States had sought federal funds or state funds to fund parochial schools. And Protestants at that time, fearful of Catholic schools, fearful that Catholic schools were anti-American or would create a parallel culture within the United States, campaigned very vigorously throughout the 19th and early 20th century against funding to Catholic schools. And so in the 1870s and the 1880s, we have the development of what are called Blaine Amendments, named after James G. Blaine, a very famous Republican presidential candidate, that banned, these were amendments at the state level that would have banned any federal funding to parochial schools. And these Blaine Amendments were not overturned until the Espinoza case in 2020, when Justice Samuel Alito and Justice John Roberts argued quite passionately for the fact that these Blaine Amendments violate the First Amendment because they discriminate against religious entities. Brust also pays particular attention to the election of 1928, where Al Smith, a very popular governor of New York, a Democratic nominee for the United States and also a faithful Catholic, got squashed in the election of 1928, and many Southern Democrats actually voted Republican in order because they feared a Catholic president. And then Brest also pays attention to the fact that over the last 50 years, as Catholics have become more accepted into American society, too many Catholics have abandoned the church on core teachings, again, on things like abortion, school choice, in order to adapt to the spirit of the times rather than faithful Catholic doctrine. A second chapter I would really recommend people to read would be Ken Grasso's chapter on religious liberty, perhaps the most important chapter in that book, where he argues that religious liberty is a difficult concept to define because there are really two different origins to religious liberty. On the one hand, religious liberty is a product of the Enlightenment, specifically John Locke. This is how religious liberty is often, the origins of religious liberty are often taught in school. But then there is the Protestant origin of religious liberty. And for 100 or 200 years, the Enlightenment and the Protestant definitions of religious liberty had overlapped. The Protestant conception of religious liberty, which would be more friendly to Catholics insofar as we partake in this common Judeo-Christian heritage. But because the Enlightenment is divorced from religion, once a culture is not as religious, the Enlightenment strain of religious liberty is not going to be sympathetic to religious liberty claims, such as the right for Catholic adoption agencies to only send children to families that would abide by the teachings of the Catholic Church, which would exclude certain types of other families, or again, the saga of the Little Sisters of the Poor, who spent millions of dollars in various court battles at the district appellate and the Supreme Court.
At the heart of it, it seems that this idea of religious liberty is kind of been almost under attack in recent years, especially. I mean, it seems like a recent surge almost in the last 5 to 10 years to really push the envelope against the idea of religious liberty. Like I just saw recently that there's a couple of older ladies that are like 78 and 77 that are headed for jail for praying outside of an abortion clinic. I mean, what do you think is what is the impetus there, you think, on the other side of things that they want to go and push this idea of religious liberty not really having any basis in the American political area?
We've had secularization occur for several generations, and with each generation, society has become more secular. Over the last 15 years, we've witnessed the rise of the quote-unquote nuns, not as in the habit of nuns, but the None. And so, according to some polls, 20 to 25% of Americans do not consider themselves spiritual or religious. And when you have such a high volume of non-religious Americans, they are, unless they've had positive experiences with other religious members, who are not going to be sympathetic to religious claims. Several hot button issues, such as abortion, there's a widespread misunderstanding among certain Americans that advocacy for abortion is intrinsically religious. And so they refuse, or they either refuse or they're unaware of rational, non-religious arguments against abortion. There is a widespread belief that marriage between one man and one woman is an inherently religious argument. And so there's a denial of any natural law arguments that could transcend religious language and appeal to a common morality. And also, there is, I think, the emergence of a different conception of love. Previous generations that had emphasized that love is self-sacrificial, that love is self-gift. And now more and more people are gravitating to this concept of love is acceptance. That if you don't accept not only the person, but the individual actions of a person, that you don't love that person. So there is this increasing view that in order to be a good person, you have to be tolerant of a variety of perspectives, and not just only be tolerant of it, but to be accepting and welcoming of these ideas. Um, so, for example, over the last 10 years, there's increased sympathy for the Church of Satan, which would have been, preposterous 15, 20 years ago.
In the introduction, you talk a little bit about this almost like I don't want to say battle necessarily, but this idea that it's two perspectives: those that sort of believe in the transcendent and those that are only thinking about the here and now. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, talk a little about that. I mean, that's sort of at the heart of a lot of these differences, isn't it?
Yes. So we argue in the book that the country has a religious origin to it. The United States was a Protestant country. Even though the First Amendment bans the establishment of a particular religion, there's widespread evidence that many of the founders believed that in order for a Republican government to succeed, there has to be a common religious culture, and that this culture does need to reflect that this culture has to have an effect upon the laws and the mores of a free people. So, for example, um, in the 19th century, it was for the most part Protestants who championed the laws banning abortion, so that by the time the year 1900 occurs, almost every country, almost every state in our country had a law banning abortion. Um, Even though Protestants insisted on the King James Bible in public schools, and this is one of the reasons why Catholics create a very robust system of parochial education in the late 19th century. Protestant America taught Bible in the schools. It had prayer in the schools, and it really is not until the 1960s, or at least maybe some of the Supreme Court cases, immediately after the war in the late 1940s, that begins to chip away at this religious heritage. Public school education in the United States always had some religious component until the last 50 years. And because even certain forms of voluntary religious instruction isn't allowed in public schools, this creates tacitly the assumption that religion is irrational, or that religion should be cast to the public sphere. If you believe the United States doesn't have a religious founding, or isn't influenced by the ideals of a common Christian culture, even if it was mediated primarily through mainstream Protestantism, there's going to be little patience for such being taught in the schools, or for any religious displays, let's say displaying the Ten Commandments in front of a federal court. And so behind this really is a battle for what it means to be an American. And even though I argue that the United States has a religious founding, and a founding imbued with many different religious ideas, we also do need to confront the fact that with such a wide number of people who no longer are Christian, or are no longer spiritual, and as we get more immigrants who come from minority faiths, we of course do have to accommodate Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and agnostics and atheists, but we have to accommodate them without denying the fact that our country is influenced by a strong Christian heritage. And for those who doubt it, I mean, there's a reason why people still expect to have off on Sundays, even though it's more common for people to work on Sundays. Sunday, the concept of the weekend, these are all Christian, part of our Christian heritage.
I had a thought, I don't know if you realize it, but today is the feast of the archangels, Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael. I mean, did it ever enter into any of the discussions that there is sort of a place to turn to in this kind of a struggle and this kind of challenge that we're facing? I mean, does the church triumphant play a role in us in sort of helping us kind of achieve maybe at least a coexistence with these differences?
Oh, absolutely. The Catholic Church has survived everything and has been thrown to it over 2,000 years. It survived empires and tyrants and monarchies and aristocracies and oligarchs and totalitarian regimes. It survived Attila, it survived Hitler, and it's going to survive, the mediocrity of the age. And in order to have this coexistence, many of the authors in this volume advocate for Catholics to, on the one hand, still remain engaged in politics, but to also emphasize that in order to have a healthy politics, there has to be a healthy culture. And so Catholicism has to go back to the basics. We have to reform our institutions. Catholics can't be too quick to throw the baby out of the bathwater when so many Catholic hospitals, universities, high schools, and the like may not be as Catholic as people want. We have to make prudential decisions about which Catholic institutions can be reformed and which ones have to be sort of put aside. There are going to be times in which we have to create parallel institutions like homeschooling co-ops or underground bakeries and things like that.
Yeah,
Yes, yes.
I think you kind of outlined in the introduction that the first half of the book tries to sort of assess kind of where we are, and the second half tries to focus on at least some ideas about how to do this coexistence. So, what are some of the thoughts that you had in that regard?
Sure. So there would be one great chapter on this deals with the Benedict option, which a lot of Catholics are attracted to. And James Calb in chapter 11 argues for a mild form of the Benedict option, where on the one hand, Catholics do need to create their own cultural networks, their own cultural institutions, but they also can't give up on the public square because while there are some Americans who are secular and are of goodwill, there are other Americans who are secular who want to eradicate Catholic ideas altogether. Another theme in a chapter on the administrative state would be Catholics have to be involved in public policy, and Catholics do need to be involved in the law. Perhaps one of the most successful ways in which Catholics have navigated the last 40 years is its strong presence in the legal field. Why were the Little Sisters of the Poor able to be protected? Because there are groups like the Becket Fund that is there to protect Catholics. There are more Catholic politicians who are able to speak using the vocabulary and the ideas of Catholic social thought to address current policy situations. Over the last 6 years, someone like Marco Rubio has been very bold in quoting Pope Leo XIII and a variety of European Catholic thinkers in the 19th and 20th century. And even though he's invoking Catholic ideas because these ideas are grounded in natural law thinking, one does not have to believe in the magisterium of the Catholic Church to argue for whether the protection of the unborn or just working conditions. And we're beginning to see, Catholics, traditional Catholics, not only emphasize many of the issues concerning sex, but also issues concerning healthcare and immigration and workers' rights and the like.
It's so I was thinking about this and sort of there's almost kind of two ways to go about this, but it sounds like you're saying that all Catholics ought to get at least involved in some way. I think what we're doing here at the college, I think, is something that certainly can help, help with the future. That we are hopefully forming students in a way that they can become participants in the political order. Uh, would you argue overall that the strategy should should not just be protection, like just like being within our own organizations, our own groups, and protecting ourselves from the outside world, but also pursuing change and maybe even pursuing evangelization. I know it was really a priority for, I think it was Pope John Paul II, Saint Pope John Paul II, that we do a better job as Catholics of evangelizing. So do you see that too as one of the solutions?
Sure. As the old saying goes, the best defense is an offense. Belmont Abbey College is increasingly epitomizing this strategy, where for example, we have a hospital now on campus, or we're soon to have a hospital on campus. We have a nursing program. We're not going to give up the healthcare profession to secularists. I think Catholics over the last two generations perhaps got too comfortable gravitating to the same professions. Catholics do need to take back many of the professions where secularists are strong. So, for example, in the mid 20th century, we had great Catholic novelists. In France, we had Bernanos and Mauriac, and in England, we had Chesterton and Tolkien. In the United States, we'd have had Walker Percy and Flannery O'Connor. And although Joshua Wren, a former professor of the Abbey, has done a great job revitalizing the Catholic arts, there's so much more within the Catholic arts, within the arts that Catholics can evangelize. Catholics can't give up on anything creative. We need Catholic graphic designers and Catholic architects. Perhaps one of the more exciting things that is beginning to emerge is there are more and more Catholics who want the return of classical architecture, who are unhappy with the brutalism of the last 60 and 70 years. And so we should take back architecture and the arts, nursing, science, and many of the programs at the Abbey, whether it is our strong biology department or our nursing program or our MBA in business administration, reflect the Abbey's commitment to be a powerful player in the public square.
It was interesting in the introduction. You also get into a little bit of a discussion of just the idea of truth is something that's debatable. That you say that the truth is what the individual personally prefers. That's kind of where our society is kind of headed, and that this choice and self recreation are elevated to the state of a human good. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of was there a particular chapter that kind of addressed that conundrum?
Yes. So again, Ken Grasso's chapter on religious liberty really outlines the Enlightenment origins to the crass individualism that is emerging. One of the strengths of Catholic social teaching is one does not have to be Catholic in order to believe it, because we make appeals to objective morality, and we can make a natural law argument without invoking natural law. When someone does not believe in objective truth and believes that truth is relative, it creates a very significant political problem. Because the question arises, what would a common good look like if everyone has a different conception of the good? And so subjectivism leads further to a dissolution of a common good. And the only way in which you create something common is by promising each other that you're not going to hurt or harm each other. But even that becomes problematic because different definitions of hurt and harm arrive from different conceptions of the good. And so we begin to splinter as a society. Um, and it's difficult to gauge the best way in which to bring back unity to that which is splintered. The way in which some people want to create the unity, which the book rejects, would be an appeal to the administrative state, would be an appeal to the Leviathan. Others are going to appeal to anarchism, or an extreme form of libertarianism, and then others are increasingly attracted to fascism, which is not an option because of its dark, evil past. The only way forward, we believe, is for the Catholic Church to have an increased uh, role in the public square by articulating the teachings of Catholic social thought and showing their universal applicability to all people and all faiths.
I was realizing today too, it was interesting that today's gospel is about Nathaniel, who is seen by Christ under the fig tree. And I don't know if you've seen. I think scholars say that maybe Nathaniel was under the fig tree because he was unhappy, and maybe he was in self pity, that kind of a thought. So it struck me that sort of a path forward for us as Catholics would be not just to stay under the fig tree, but to join Christ and to follow Christ and to sort of reach out and try to transform our culture for the good for everybody.
Yes, and it's difficult insofar as we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard than what the culture holds themselves to. But with the grace of Christ, that is possible. The 20th century, on the one hand, has so many martyrs, but the 20th century has so many saints from so many different backgrounds, professions, and different countries. And we have to remember in the darkest of times that holiness is possible. And as scary as the culture may be at this time, um, women like Saint Agnes or Saint Lucy or Saint Anastasia died joyfully for Christ. And we in the United States have not been asked to do that, and probably will not be asked to do that for any foreseeable future. But when I applied for the honors job 2 years ago, I was asked what advice would I give to my students, and the answer I eventually settled on is to be grateful for what one has and to avoid temptations to despair. And I think sometimes when I'm on Twitter or a social media, there is a temptation for Catholics who, faithful Catholics who go to Mass every Sunday, to fall in this temptation of despair. And they have to remember that it is a sin, a very evil one at that, because despair is a sin against hope. And it's ultimately in hope, it's ultimately in the theological virtues where we will come to Christ.
So the title of the book says "The Future of the Catholic Church in the American Political Order," but it sounds like, on the face of it, you might think that talks about politics. That means I have to become a politician, but that's not really what you're saying. You're saying that every one of us has a role to play, and hopefully creating a future for us.
Oh, absolutely. So in political science, there's, of course, the great debate about what politics means. But we use politics in its Aristotelian form, where politics is sort of the master science and would include things like economics and culture. Everything is ultimately connected. And the way in which to have a healthy political order will be to have a healthy cultural and social order.
So what is the risk of doing nothing, you think, going forward? What is the risk of us sort of going and hiding ourselves from the culture, if as sort of our own personal solution?
The most important reason is theological. It violates the Great Commission of Jesus, where we are to preach the gospel to all corners of the earth. But if people want some good old-fashioned self-interested arguments, Um, Catholic institutions, even though they are Catholic, are public institutions, and they engage with people who are non-Catholic. And a variety of Catholic institutions are not self-sufficient. They're dependent upon federal funds or state funds. And if the federal government or the state government decides that religious institutions are no longer worth saving or worth giving money to, if the federal government were to not give aid to the Salvation Army or something like that, Catholic institutions would be some Catholic institutions would have to close down, and so we believe in a Catholic Church and Catholic institutions that should receive some funding for the government while also remaining faithful to the teachings of the Catholic Church, because these Catholic institutions simply don't benefit, they benefit primarily the Catholic Church, but they benefit our country insofar as Catholic schools are some of the best schools in the country and have been for over 100 years. Catholic hospitals are some of the best hospitals in the country, and Catholic adoption agencies are some of the best adoption agencies in the country as well.
You may have touched on this a little bit, but I'm trying to wrap things up. There's a nice quote in the introduction that says something. They pass the days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. So, summarize maybe just for us as we try to live that life, as we try to live that ideal out. Where is the hope for the everyday Catholic in the future of America?
The hope, I think, rests with the fact that we have to voluntarily choose to be Catholic. And it is very encouraging, in the Diocese of Charlotte or Belmont Abbey College, that so many young people and so many young families exist, that they have voluntarily chosen to remain faithful to the teachings of the Catholic Church when there are hardly any TV shows, movies, music, novels, works of contemporary literature that support the Catholic mission. And so there's this real countercultural Catholicism that is alive and exciting, that is having many children, and is joyful. If you walk around Belmont Abbey, people are laughing and smiling, and they are great witnesses to Christ. We are witnessing a revival of classical education, revival of Christian classical education that is shared by both Protestants and the Orthodox. And we are fighting back in education by providing educational alternatives to the mediocrity of the public schools. And there is hope in the fact that we have the truth. Our arguments are ultimately correct. And if one takes the time in order to study the great tradition of Catholicism, whether it's Thomistic natural law or the great body of 20th century papal encyclicals, one begins to know that Catholics have many answers to a variety of contemporary problems. We may not have exact answers, but we at least have the guiding principles necessary to address the problems, whether it is abortion, sexuality, or immigration or healthcare.
Well, great, great conversation. Tell us when you expect the book to be available.
So the book will be out at the end of October. It is
Excellent.
published by Franciscan University Press, but Catholic University of America will be distributing it. And it is about $30 online. You can pre-order at the Catholic University of America website. And it's a truly a great book, a great read, and I hope you enjoy it.
Well, great. Thank you for your time. We appreciate it. We look forward to seeing the book come out. I totally enjoyed the introduction. I can't wait to read the rest of it. So Thanks for your time. Great to see you. For folks who are watching, thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please like, share, follow, subscribe, do all those good things. And we are on Google, we are on Spotify, we are on Apple. So thanks very much. God bless, and we look forward to seeing you soon.